Alright, this is the fourth in a series of recordings for the reproductive system in the pelvis, and I'm focusing on innervation for this recording. Alright, sympathetic innervation. So first of all, we'll talk about the autonomic innervation, then the somatic innervation of the pelvis. For sympathetic innervation, you recall that there are no sympathetic fibers arising from the spinal cord below the level of L2, 3. So what happens is, from the spinal cord at L1 to L3, preganglionic fibers are exiting the spinal cord and they're going to enter the sympathetic chain. And then they're going to do one of two things depending on whether they're going to be innervating the body wall of the pelvis. Alright, so we're talking about skin and muscles, or the pelvic viscera. Okay, so one of two things. So that the words were described above, but in this image I'm going to use this image to describe it. So on the left side of the spinal cord, you can see there are fibers arising from L1, L2, for example. They're entering the spinal cord and then they're synapsing. Okay, and where the blue bracket is indicating, those fibers are going to be going to the body wall of the pelvis through the innervate glands and hair follicles and the blood vessels of the body wall. On the right side of the figure, fibers again from L1 and L2, maybe L3, they are going to the sympathetic chain, but they're bypassing it, which is indicated by the orange arrow, and they're going to the inferior mesenteric ganglion, or the prevertebral ganglion, where they will then synapse, and then they'll go to all the pelvic visceral structures. Right? So that's the major difference. Okay, so once they go to the inferior mesenteric ganglion and they synapse, then they're going to go through this complicated series of plexuses to get to their final destination. They will go to the superior hypogastric plexus, highlighted by the blue circle, and then they'll go to left or right hypogastric nerves to dive down into the pelvis, and then ultimately to an inferior hypogastric plexus where they will be joined by parasympathetic fibers. Now, from the inferior hypogastric plexus, they're going to go to yet further plexuses that are associated with each particular organ that they're going to. And we'll talk about that in a second. Alright, so that's sympathetic. Parasympathetic fibers are arising from the spinal cord S2 to S4 levels. They are exiting through the spinal roots of S2, 3, and 4, where there you can see the blue twigs highlighted by the red circle are going to come off, and those are the parasympathetic fibers from S2, 3, and 4. Those are going to join with the sympathetic fibers in the inferior hypogastric plexus highlighted by the green circle, and they will then go to the various organs. So parasympathetic S2 to S4. Alright, so what happens when they come together? This is just sort of an overview again, where you can see the red box is showing the sympathetic chain ganglia. From there they exit the sympathetic chain to the lumbar splanchnic nerves, ultimately going to the inferior mesenteric ganglion, then to the hypogastric plexus system. Okay, and then you can see the blue box, which are the pelvic splanchnic nerves from S2 to S4, parasympathetics joining the hypogastric plexus. So that's kind of an overview slide of that again. And this is another overview slide again, but this one's showing you some of those nerve plexuses around the different organs down below. Alright, so what's happening? Alright, so for the bladder and the internal urethral sphincter, there's a vesical plexus. Okay, so a plexus of nerves containing parasympathetic and sympathetic fibers, and you can see what each of those fibers are contributing for parasympathetic and sympathetic. Okay, parasympathetic ultimately is contributing to urination. Sympathetic is contributing to maintenance of continence. Okay. Vas deferens, seminal vesicle, and prostate are exclusively innervated by sympathetic fibers contributing to ejaculation. So for example, the vas deferens, they're contributing, sympathetic fibers are stimulating the muscles within the vas deferens to move sperm down the vas deferens. Okay? Now within the prostatic plexus, so this is a nerve plexus surrounding the prostate, which is found in that dense capsule of the prostate. There are parasympathetic fibers, but they are bypassing the prostate to go to the erectile tissues of the penis to stimulate erection. Now that has important clinical implications, understanding that, so that's important. All right, uterus, vagina, uterine tubes. There is another plexus containing sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers, the uterovaginal plexus. Okay, and so you can see kind of what those are doing there. Okay. There's an important note: the inferior 1/3 of the vagina has a different embryologic origin, and it actually has somatic innervation, motor and sensory, which we'll talk about in the perineum. It's innervated by the pudendal nerve. Alright, so the inferior third of the vagina is somatic. Alright, so that's an overview of the autonomic nervous system. Now on to the somatic. Somatic to the pelvis is through the sacral plexus, L2 to L4 to S4. You've learned about the sacral plexus in lower limbs, so I'm not too concerned about it. The only thing I want to remind you of is the fact that the sacral plexus sits on the piriformis muscle, which you can see here in the red circle. And one of the major branches off of this sacral plexus that you need to know about is the pudendal nerve. All right, the pudendal nerve we'll talk more specifically in the perineum because it has important innervation to the perineal structures, but its course in the pelvis is really important, and that's what I want to focus on here. So going to this slide, looking at the red arrow, that's the pudendal nerve, and its course is unique because it has this meandering pathway. It exits the pelvis first through the greater sciatic foramen, and it wraps around the ischial spine, which is highlighted in green, and then it re-enters the pelvis through the lesser sciatic foramen, okay, which is the blue arrow. Okay, now once it's re-entered the pelvis, then it's going to travel through the pudendal canal, which is a canal that's associated with the obturator internus, which you can see in the lower figure. Runs through that pudendal canal, and then it's going to branch extensively to supply all the different structures of the perineal region. All right, so that's just an overview of the pudendal nerve and its course and all of the autonomic innervation to the pelvis.